The wind howled outside, a fierce force that rattled the windows and shook the walls of the small, humble house. Snow fell in thick, swirling sheets, making the outside world disappear into a white, featureless blur. Elia sat by the window, staring out at the blizzard, her hands trembling as she clutched a woolen blanket tightly around her. The storm had come quickly, catching everyone off guard. What had started as a light snowfall soon turned into a furious blizzard, with winds strong enough to knock down trees and block the roads. Inside the house, it was warm, but not warm enough to fight off the chill that crept through the cracks in the walls. The fire in the hearth had burned down to little more than a few embers, casting weak, flickering shadows across the room. Elia stared at the flames, her mind racing. She had never seen a storm like this before. It felt like the very world was closing in around them, trapping them here in the cold, dark house. Her son, Joran, was lying on the couch nearby. His small body was covered with several blankets, but he shivered uncontrollably, his face flushed with fever. Elia's heart ached as she watched him, his tiny chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. He had been ill for several days now, but this morning his condition had worsened. At first, it had seemed like just a cold, but now she wasn't sure. His fever was high, and he couldn't seem to keep anything down. The storm had cut off all communication with the outside world. No one could get in or out. The village was isolated, and even though the townspeople had always looked out for one another, this time it seemed they had all retreated into their own homes, just like Elia. No one had come to check on her, and she hadn't been able to go out. As the hours passed, the situation grew more desperate. Elia had no food left except for a few scraps of bread and some dried fruit. She had tried everything she could think of to bring Joran's fever down: cool cloths, extra blankets, even a small amount of water to drink, but nothing worked. She had given him a sip of the herbal medicine she had made herself, but it seemed to have no effect. Joran's cough had become worse as well. It was a dry, rattling sound that shook his tiny body with each fit. He had barely opened his eyes all day, and now he lay there motionless, his face pale and drawn. Elia's worry deepened with each passing minute. She had no way to get help. The village doctor lived on the other side of the town, but no one could reach him through this storm. Elia had considered walking, but the snow was too deep and the wind was too strong. It was impossible to travel in such conditions. Elia leaned over Joran's still form, brushing a strand of damp hair from his forehead. His skin was warm, too warm, and her stomach twisted with fear. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him, not like this, not when they were so close to getting through the storm. She had lost so much already in her life. Her husband had passed away 2 years ago, leaving her to raise Joran on her own. But she had always managed, always found a way to keep going. She couldn't lose him too. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft noise like a knock on the door. Elia's head shot up, her heart pounding in her chest. She held her breath, listening intently, but there was only the howling of the wind. Could it have been the wind? It sounded almost like a knock, but it couldn't have been. The storm was too strong. Then it came again, another knock, this time louder. Elia's breath caught in her throat. She quickly stood up and hurried to the door, her heart racing. Could it be someone from the village? Was it possible that someone had braved the storm to check on her? She hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door, fear and hope mixing in her chest. Slowly, she pulled it open, just wide enough to peek outside. But there was no one there. Confused, Elia looked left and right, her eyes searching through the blinding snow. There was nothing but white. The storm had completely obscured the world outside, and yet she could have sworn she had heard someone knocking. The sound came again, and this time Elia realized it was coming from the side of the house. She quickly moved to the window and peered out, but still, there was nothing in sight. Her heart sank. It was probably just the wind playing tricks on her. The thought of hope flickered inside her and then quickly died out. She stood there for a moment, uncertain whether she should close the door and give in to the growing dread that filled her chest. But before she could make her decision, she heard another sound, this time a voice. "Hello, is anyone there?" Elia froze. The voice was faint, muffled by the wind, but it was unmistakably human. She rushed to the door, throwing it wide open, and stepped out into the swirling snow. "Who's there?" she called, her voice hoarse from the cold. There, standing in the storm, was a figure. He was tall and dressed in a heavy coat, but the snow and wind made it hard to make out any details. Elia squinted against the storm, her heart racing. The man looked like he had been traveling for some time. His face was covered with a scarf and goggles, but his eyes were bright with determination. "I'm sorry to bother you," the man said, his voice strong and clear despite the wind. "I'm lost. I've been trying to find shelter. I saw your house from the road and I thought I could make it here." Elia stood frozen for a moment, disbelief filling her. Was this real? Was this man really here? She couldn't tell if it was a dream or if, in her desperation, she had imagined him. But then the reality of the situation hit her. This man, this stranger, had somehow found her house in the middle of the blizzard. She had to let him in. "Please, come inside," she said quickly, stepping aside to let him in. The man didn't hesitate. He quickly made his way through the door, the warmth of the house meeting him like a soft embrace. As he entered, Elia closed the door behind him, keeping the storm at bay. The man immediately took off his gloves and hat, shaking the snow from his hair. He turned to Elia, his face tired but kind. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I didn't know if I'd make it here." Elia nodded silently, her eyes still fixed on him, unsure of what to say. "You're welcome," she finally managed. I don't know how you found me in this storm." "I'm lucky," he replied with a tired smile, "but I think you need more help than I do." Elia's heart skipped a beat and she suddenly felt a pang of hope. "My son," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's sick, very sick. I don't know what to do. No one can get to us in this storm." The man's eyes softened with sympathy. He glanced over at Joran, still lying on the couch, pale and feverish. "Let me help," he said. "I'm no doctor, but I've seen enough to know that we can't waste any time." Without another word, he moved toward Joran's side, kneeling beside him. Elia watched him with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Could this stranger really help her son? As the man carefully examined Joran, Elia stood back, her heart in her throat. She had no choice but to trust him. She had to. There was no other option. The storm outside raged on, but inside, for the first time in hours, there was a glimmer of hope. The warmth of the cabin felt like a lifeline to Elia as she watched the man kneel beside her son, Joran. His hands were steady and sure as he gently pressed his fingers against Joran's wrist, checking his pulse. The boy's feverish skin felt like fire, and his breathing was shallow, his small chest rising and falling with effort. Elia hovered nearby, a quiet desperation in her eyes. She had watched her son struggle, helpless to do anything. She had tried everything she knew, herbal teas, cool cloths, and even prayers, but nothing had worked. The fear that had been gnawing at her insides only deepened as the man examined Joran's condition. She had always trusted her instincts, and now those instincts were screaming at her to trust this stranger. But could she? The man looked up at her, his face serious but not without compassion. "He's very sick," he said softly. "This is more than just a cold. His body's fighting something more." Elia nodded silently, biting her lip. "What can we do? Please, you have to help him." He stood up slowly, running a hand through his damp hair. "I'll do what I can, but we need to move quickly. The fever's too high and it's not going down on its own." Elia's heart pounded in her chest. The man seemed so calm, so collected in the face of the storm, and yet she could see the concern in his eyes. She didn't know his name, where he came from, or even how he had found her in the middle of this blizzard. All she knew was that he was here now, and that meant he was her only hope. The man turned to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do you have any more blankets?" Something that might help keep him warm. Elia nodded quickly. Yes, I have a few more in the closet. She rushed to the small wooden closet in the corner of the room, pulling out the thickest blankets she could find. They were old but soft, worn from years of use, and she hoped they would be enough. She handed them to the man, who immediately spread them over Joran, layering them carefully to keep the warmth close to his body. His movements were quick but gentle, like he knew exactly what needed to be done. As the man worked, Elia paced nervously. She wanted to help, wanted to do something, but she didn't know what. She was scared, terrified that her son might slip away from her, and she would never get the chance to say goodbye. The blizzard raged outside, and it felt as though the world was closing in on them. The man worked quietly, his face a mask of concentration as he moved around the room, gathering supplies. Elia watched him, trying to make sense of the situation. He had appeared out of nowhere, braving the storm to reach her when no one else had. But what if he was only one man and his efforts weren't enough? Finally, he turned to her. "I need to get him something stronger," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We can't wait for the storm to pass. I'll go out and look for something to help with his fever. You need to stay here and keep him warm." Elia's eyes widened in shock. "You're going out there, in that storm?" She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The storm had been growing more dangerous by the hour, the wind howling like a wild animal, and the snow falling so thick that it was impossible to see anything beyond a few feet. The thought of him going back out into that seemed insane. "I know the storm," he said simply, his voice steady. "I'll be fine, you stay here with him." Elia opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. She didn't want him to go, she didn't want to be alone, but there was no time to argue. She could see the urgency in his eyes, the way his jaw was clenched in determination. He wasn't going to change his mind. "I'll be quick," he promised. "Just keep him warm and stay with him." Without waiting for her reply, he grabbed his coat, pulling it on quickly and heading for the door. Elia rushed to the window, watching as he stepped outside into the storm. The wind nearly took him off his feet, and for a moment she thought he might not make it. But he pressed on, disappearing into the white wilderness as the snow continued to fall in thick, heavy sheets. Elia stood there, her heart in her throat, unable to look away from the spot where he had vanished. The house felt colder now, even with the fire still crackling weakly in the hearth. She returned to Joran's side, sitting down next to him and brushing his damp hair away from his forehead. She couldn't help but feel that time was running out. The storm outside wasn't letting up, and it felt as though it was closing in around them, trapping them in this tiny cabin. She had no idea what was happening to her son, and the uncertainty was almost unbearable. Joran's breathing was still shallow, and his skin was burning hot to the touch. She gently held his hand, hoping that somehow she could transfer some of her warmth into him. His tiny fingers twitched in response, and her heart lifted a little. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours. Elia couldn't stop glancing at the door, waiting for the man to return. Every sound in the distance seemed amplified, every gust of wind a reminder that the storm was still there, relentless and unyielding. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. Elia's heart skipped a beat as the man stepped back into the cabin, his coat covered in snow, his face reddened from the cold. He looked exhausted, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "I found something," he said, his voice breathless but relieved. "It's not much, but it should help." He walked over to Joran's side and pulled out a small pouch from his pocket. Inside were dried herbs and leaves, which he quickly began to prepare. He mixed them with hot water from the kettle and placed the steaming cup to Joran's lips. Elia watched in silence as the man worked, her eyes never leaving her son. The smell of the herbs was earthy and strong, but it was something she had never smelled before. She had heard of medicinal plants that could bring down a fever, but she didn't know if this would work. She had no choice but to trust him. Joran's lips parted, and Elia gently guided the cup to his mouth. He swallowed weakly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Elia saw a faint sign of life in his eyes. He didn't speak, but his body seemed to relax, his breathing evening out. The man looked up at Elia, a small, tired smile on his face. "It's going to take a little time," he said softly, "but this should help." Elia nodded, her heart full of gratitude. She didn't know who this man was or how he had found her, but she knew one thing for certain. Without him, she might have lost her son. She reached out, taking his hand in her own, her fingers trembling as she looked at him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for saving him." The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he simply nodded and sat down beside her. He didn't speak much, but his presence was comforting, like a steady anchor in the midst of the storm. They sat in silence, watching as Joran's fever began to slowly subside, his breathing becoming more even with each passing moment. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, there was a quiet sense of peace. The worst wasn't over, but for the first time since the blizzard began, Elia felt like there was hope. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now she had her son, and that was enough. The man's quiet strength had given her a reason to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could make it through this storm. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the cabin, the warmth from the fire and the care of the stranger made the space feel a little safer. Elia sat beside Joran, watching as his breathing gradually became steadier. His fever had started to subside, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel a small glimmer of hope. The man had saved him, she thought. This stranger who had appeared out of nowhere had somehow turned the tide when everything seemed lost. Elia glanced over at the man, who was sitting across the room, quietly tending to the fire. He had not spoken much since he returned with the herbs. His face was still weary, his eyes tired, but there was a certain calmness in him now. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one inside his heart, she could tell. He had risked everything to help them, and yet he remained so composed. Are you all right?" Elia asked softly, unsure if she should disturb his quiet thoughts. He looked up from the fire and gave her a tired smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine. Just exhausted, I suppose, but I'm glad I could help." Elia nodded and turned back to Joran. His cheeks, though still flushed, no longer felt burning hot. His small chest rose and fell with each breath, and though he wasn't fully awake, there was a softness in his expression, a peace that hadn't been there before. Elia's heart swelled with relief, but it was still mixed with worry. She knew the worst wasn't over yet. The storm was far from passing, and they had no idea how long they would be stuck here. She had never felt so isolated before. The storm had cut them off from the rest of the world, and she had no idea when or if anyone would come to their aid. For now, all she could do was wait and watch. Hours passed, though it felt like much longer. The wind howled relentlessly outside, rattling the walls and window panes of the cabin. Snow continued to fall in thick layers, the world beyond their small shelter a frozen blur. Elia could hear the faint sound of the man moving around the room, checking the fire, adjusting the blankets, and making sure Joran was still comfortable. He hadn't said much, but his actions spoke volumes. He was determined to see this through, and his silent strength gave Elia something to hold on to. She leaned back against the wall, her tired eyes finally closing for a moment. She had barely slept in days, worried for Joran and the storm. But now, with the warmth of the fire and the man's presence filling the room, she felt her body start to relax, even if just for a few minutes. She tried to keep herself alert, but the exhaustion of the last several days was catching up with her. She must have fallen asleep, because when she awoke, the fire was lower and the room was quieter than before. Her heart raced as she sat up quickly, but when her eyes landed on Joran, she felt the tension in her chest ease. He was still breathing steadily, his body now no longer as feverish as it had been earlier. He looked peaceful, his small face relaxed in sleep. Elia took a deep breath, her eyes lifting to find the man. He was sitting near the window, staring out into the storm, his back to her. His posture was tense, his hands resting on his knees as though he were deep in thought. "Thank you," Elia said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, but she knew he heard her. She had said the words before, but now they felt more meaningful. "You saved him." "I don't know how to thank you enough." The man turned slowly, his gaze meeting hers. There was a sadness in his eyes, something that seemed to reflect the weight of his journey. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "There's no need to thank me," he said quietly. "I did what anyone would have done. The real thanks will come when your son gets better." Elia felt a lump form in her throat. "But you didn't have to help us. You didn't even know us. And yet, you risked your life in that storm to save him." The man's expression softened, but he didn't speak right away. Instead, he stood up slowly and walked toward Joran's side, placing a gentle hand on the boy's forehead, checking his temperature once more. Elia watched him, trying to make sense of everything. She had so many questions, so many things she didn't understand, but in that moment, all she could focus on was the fact that her son was alive. And for that, she would be forever grateful. "I was just passing through," the man said quietly, his voice a little distant. "The storm caught me off guard, too. But when I saw your house, when I saw you and your son in there alone, I couldn't just keep going. I couldn't leave you out here in the cold." His words made Elia's heart ache, and she found herself staring at him in silence. She had seen many people in her life, but she had never met someone like him. There was a quiet strength to him, a kindness that was so rare in the world, and it reminded her of the way her late husband had been. Strong, dependable, and always ready to help others, even when he had nothing left for himself. Elia felt a sudden wave of emotion. The loss of her husband still stung deeply, even after all these years. She had tried so hard to keep everything together for Joran, but there were moments when the weight of it all felt too much to carry. But this man, this stranger who had entered their lives when they needed it most, had reminded her that kindness still existed in the world, even in the darkest of storms. "I'm Elia," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And this is Joran." The man nodded. "I'm Marcus," he replied simply. His voice held no pretense, no ego, just quiet honesty. Elia smiled faintly, feeling a small connection to him in that simple exchange. It wasn't much, but in a world where so many people turned away from each other, this moment felt important. A small spark of humanity in a world buried by snow. As the evening wore on, the storm outside began to grow even fiercer, but inside, the cabin remained a safe haven. Elia stayed close to Joran, watching over him as he rested, his fever now much lower than before. The herbs that Marcus had given him had worked wonders, and Elia found herself grateful that, despite everything, her son seemed to be getting stronger with every hour that passed. Marcus, for his part, continued to keep busy. He had already checked the fire and made sure the room stayed warm, and now he was rummaging through his pack, looking for something. Elia watched him curiously, but didn't ask what he was doing. She didn't want to interrupt his focus. He pulled out a small bundle of cloth and some tools, then began to prepare something with quiet precision. Elia finally stood up and walked over to him, unsure if she should speak or wait for him to tell her what he was doing. But before she could say anything, Marcus looked up at her. "I'll fix the door soon," he said, his voice still calm. "The wind's blowing through the cracks. We don't want the temperature to drop in here." Elia nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and awe. "Thank you. We're lucky you found us." Marcus didn't reply, but he smiled a little and went back to his work. Elia couldn't help but watch him. She had no idea where he had come from, or what had led him to this small village, but she knew one thing for sure. He was a person who didn't give up. Even in the face of danger when others would have run, Marcus had chosen to stay. The minutes stretched into hours, and Elia couldn't remember the last time she had felt so safe, so protected. The storm might still be raging outside, But inside, the small cabin was a sanctuary, a place where, for the first time in days, she could finally breathe. And as the night deepened and Joran slept peacefully beside her, Elia closed her eyes for the first time in what felt like forever, knowing that no matter what happened, they were no longer alone. The storm would pass, and with it, the uncertainty that had plagued her for so long. And for the first time she felt that perhaps, just maybe, there was hope after all.